do we now have to prepare for an eventuality where the US doesn't just abandon or lessen its support for European allies, but could it actually be an adversary? Does Canada need to prepare for even the remote possibility that the US could one day attack it?
I think we should be extremely afraid of the prospect of a real military alliance between Russia and the United States under Donald Trump. I think that there is an ideological affinity between Putin and Trump, but also Trump is fascinated by Putin for some reason. We don't know exactly what. Some people say that he's a Russian asset. We don't know, but certainly he's pro-Putin in many ways. And just the way he talks about Zelensky and Putin, he will criticize Zelensky, say he's a dictator. He will not say the same thing about Putin at all. So I think the risk of a realignment and an alliance between Russia and the US is a real threat under Trump. And Trump is so unpredictable. But one thing that is predictable with him is that he likes Vladimir Putin very much. And this is a threat to the free world. I use an old expression, maybe from the Cold War. But I think Europeans and Canadians, we have to beef up our military in a dramatic way. And maybe, that this will not last. We don't know what will happen with Trump. He cannot run again, although some Republicans are, already talking about Trump 2028. And he showed a picture of him, on social media with a crown on his head. And there is J.D. Vance, who wants to be the heir and throne, and who's frankly, in some ways, perhaps scarier than Trump. And because he wants to show that he's a real Trumpian and so forth. And what he's done so far with regard to Ukraine, frankly, is and what he said about Ukraine is frankly revolting. So we are not out of the woods yet, that's for sure. And I think we should prepare for the worst. We have discussion, for example, in Europe about the British and French nuclear power. You have the nukes. We don't in Canada. European countries don't have the nukes except you and the UK. I mean, the fear is not necessarily that that the US will try to invade Europe, but that they will just give the green light, or at least implicitly, for Vladimir Putin to invade, the Baltic countries, perhaps Poland, or Romania, or Moldova, and so forth. And then that's a scary prospect, because if they will invade the countries that have that are EU members and are NATO countries, because what will happen with NATO? Will the US actually opt out of NATO? There is talk of that right now. If the US opt out of NATO, it will mean a total reconfiguration of our national security apparatus here in Canada and in Europe. So yes, I think we need to, sometimes people say don't panic and so forth, and, stay calm. And but sometimes I think it's good to panic a little bit, or at least to prepare, to stay calm, but prepare for worst case scenarios. And one of the worst case scenarios is an actual alliance between Russia and the United States under Trump that could become a major security threat for Canada, Europe, and frankly, the rest of the world.
Spell out for us, what is the nominal rationale, at least, for Donald Trump's attacks on Canada?
Sometimes it's actually hard to say, because it seems that the goalposts are always shifting. As I compare it, sometimes it's like riding a roller coaster, but blindfolded, right? Because he changes his mind regularly. He's really, he can be really nasty, but also mercurial. And so you just never know exactly what will happen next. And frankly, it's dizzying and quite scary, because don't forget, Canada is much smaller than the United States. We depend a lot on the United States for our trade. About 3/4 of our goods that are exported outside of Canada, they go to the United States. So it's enormous in terms of trade relationship, but also militarily. For a long time, we have, since the Second World War, we have depended a lot on the United States for our national security. And we also share the longest land border in the world. So, very close relationship economically in terms of national security. We have a long border. We sometimes, of course, face tensions between Canada and the United States. But what we have been seeing since January 20th, since the return of Trump to the White House, is unprecedented. I would say we've never heard an American president say these things about Canada since the creation of our country in 1867. At first, it was all about fentanyl, right? Fentanyl and drug problem. Although we know that only a very, very small portion of the fentanyl that enters the United States comes from Canada. It's tiny, tiny, right? Almost insignificant compared to what comes from, say, Mexico. So that was really about border security and fentanyl at first. And Trump said, if you protect your border properly and you stop the flow of fentanyl from north to south, then, we'll lift the tariffs. But Trump has provided other rationales for the tariffs over time, right? So when he mentioned our banking system, that we have basically strong regulations. And so although U.S. banks do business in Canada, as opposed to what Trump says, because don't forget, Trump's rationales also, I would say grounded in lies, outright lies about what's going on, right? About the security at the Canada-U.S. border, but also about, the trade imbalance between the two countries, which in fact would not exist if it was not of our energy, especially our oil exports, and we sell oil to the U.S. at a discount price. So, there are a lot of things here that, are very far from factual analysis, right? He seems to be asking for a move towards deregulating our financial and banking sector to allow more U.S. banks to do more business in Canada. But the fact that we have a better regulated, a more regulated financial and banking system is what helped us a lot in 2008 during the financial crisis. We didn't have a subprime mortgage crisis like in the U.S., right? And so there's reluctance to do that, of course. But Donald Trump has mentioned other things. Our low military spending, and that's a fair criticism. Canada is way behind the NATO target of 2%. And I think, we are trying to catch up with this, but it's too slow. But he has also talked about other things, including making Canada the 51st state. And also a more general argument for tariffs, that it's a source of revenues for the federal government, which could finance tax cuts for Americans, especially for higher income Americans, although that's not the way he frames it. So, lots of different rationales out there. So it's a bit difficult, even I think for Canadian officials, to really know what's the end game for Trump. Is it just about raising more revenues? In that case, there's no much hope. What can we do against this? If he's really a protectionist and he believes that tariffs are a revenue generating tool and that can finance tax cuts, what can we do against this except saying it won't work? I think the best hope for Canada right now is that there's a strong pushback from American consumers, from American citizens, and that the Democratic Party also wakes up and fights back in a strong way against what Donald Trump is doing, because these tariffs are hurting U.S. consumers. They are hurting Canada more than the U.S., but they are hurting U.S. consumers as well.
Can you give us a sense of what this means in real terms for Canadians? How, on the scale of 25% tariffs will affect the Canadian economy and the lives of ordinary Canadians?
So this is creating really major problems, and not just problems for Canada, but for the U.S., because our economies are so integrated. I mean, the poster child of this is the auto industry, the car industry, right? So and actually tariffs on the automotive, the car industry were lifted very early by Trump, when we realized that U.S. car manufacturers, so the big three, Chrysler, GM, and Ford, they were really afraid and angry, frankly, at these tariffs, because they said, when you impose tariffs on the Canadian car industry, when parts cross the border back and forth between different factories on both sides of the border, then you hurt us. You hurt the American economy, not just the Canadian economy. If the tariffs will be 25% will be fully implemented for a significant period of time, because we know that Trump is changing his mind regularly about this. This will, of course, trigger an increase in unemployment, will certainly trigger a recession. And frankly, if the US is already, it seems, might be heading towards a recession already, some economists say it's at least 50% chance, maybe higher, that the United States might be already entering a recession. Canada will get our recession too, even regardless of the tariffs themselves. Because as we say in Canada, when the US sneezes, we catch a cold. I think that there is a strong pushback in Canada. There's also a movement called Buy Canadian. We have many businesses have removed, for example, in the liquor sector, they have removed American wine and liquor from the shelves. So there's a strong, I would say, even emotional reaction to this, right? From an economic standpoint, it's bad for Canada. So even if you're just thinking rationally about this, it's very bad. But if you add the emotional toll on the top of this and being treated like an adversary rather than a friend or at least an ally, and the rhetoric about the 51st state, which we don't really know exactly what the end game is, but we know it's an insult to us from an ally, or at least a former ally.
Let's look at what the options are for Canada at this point. I mean, one of the ideas that we've heard Justin Trudeau discuss is dollar for dollar tariffs. Can you explain what that looks like and how that would work in practice? What are the pros? What are the cons of that sort of response?
The problem with this response is that it will hurt Canadians, perhaps more than Americans, or it will have a negative impact on our economy as well, right? At the same time, we have to show that we are standing up to Trump. We cannot just do nothing. And some economists, I know people in business school, said we should not adopt retaliatory tariffs at all because it will hurt us and our workers and consumers as well. It will make things worse for us in a way than just the U.S. tariffs. But the counterpoint to this, which is a political counterpoint, is that Trump is a bully. And he thrives on bullying people. We saw that with Zelensky in the Oval Office a couple of weeks ago. We see that in terms of using tariffs, not just as an economic tool or a fiscal tool in terms of revenue generation, as I mentioned earlier, but really as a political tool. It's a tool of I would say intimidation. It's a threat. And he's using that politically to get things he wants from different countries, right? And not just things that are about border security or about trade, other things as well, like the deregulation of our banking system, for example, which he has alluded to, and maybe other things. So we have to respond. And even if it hurts us, I think it's important to do it.
Trudeau has said Trump's the explanations that he's given are completely bogus. That his real game here is to cause a collapse of the Canadian economy so that it will be easier to annex Canada. I mean, how seriously should we take this idea that there could be a real threat, a real intention to take some or part of Canada?
Well, the thing with Trump is that we just don't know what the end game is, right? As I mentioned earlier. So what is the after exactly? I think natural resources is a major issue. There has been discussion in terms of at least rumors about him wanting to maybe redraw the Canada-US border around the Great Lakes, for example. There is all the issue of Arctic sovereignty. We are an Arctic country like the US with Alaska. And there's been also, again, these are more rumors, but about maybe even Russia and the US collaborating economically in the Arctic, which is a major threat to us in Canada, right? Because Russia is our neighbor too from the other side of the Arctic, right? In a sense. And so even if it's not about an outright, invasion of Canada and so forth, or even a peaceful annexation, which will be quite complicated to do, and this is not something that you can do normally unilaterally with the executive branch. You will need actually to go through Congress to do that. And, but certainly there's an attack on Canada's sovereignty, regardless of what the scale of it is. And if it's really about outright annexion or something more modest, there's a sense that, Donald Trump is after our natural resources. And that's very serious.
How is this changing the conversation in Canada? What are you seeing in terms of the renewed sense of Canadian national identity and patriotism.
Yes, so sales of Canadian flags have been up quite dramatically. There is, yes, a renewed sense of patriotism that's also evident when you look at polling data. And the pride of being Canadian. If you ask people, are you proud of being Canadian? The numbers are up quite dramatically from what they were just in December, right? And even in Quebec, here where I am, where normally pride in Canada is not as high as in other provinces, it's still lower, but it bounced back more dramatically than in any other province. So I think we are seeing a surge in a form of, I would say, reaction against what we perceive as an attack on our sovereignty and our economy that is leading people to emphasize differences between Canada and the United States and say, we are not like you, we will never be part of you.
What does this mean in terms of Canada's relations with Europe? We've also seen Trudeau travel to Kyiv, talk about Canada perhaps being part of a coalition of the willing as a security force to enter Ukraine. I mean, does this cause Canada to look now much more readily at cooperation with Europe, to look, I guess, east from Canada instead of south?
Absolutely. I think that, we have a trade agreement with the European Union that was signed years ago, but it hasn't been fully ratified and implemented. So we are working on that. I think UK is also important for a number of reasons. Historically, we are part of the Commonwealth, of course. We share the same king and many other things, and we have strong economic relations. Of course, it's not the same as Canada-US relations in terms of scale, but I think there is more work to do to diversify our economy. And I think the UK and the European Union are major markets for us and trade partners. In the case of Ukraine, Canadians on average are very pro-Ukraine, like I think most Europeans. But there is an added factor here in Canada is that we have a lot of people of Ukrainian descent, not just recent immigrants, but also, especially in Western Canada, people who came here at the decades and decades ago, even more than a century ago, to populate the West. And these people are very proud of their Ukrainian roots. So I think there is a silver lining here in a way with all this mess and this, frankly, gong show. It's really threatening, it's scary, but will force us to further diversify our economy and to spend more energy building or rebuilding our military, which is in a really sad state, frankly. We should have done that a long time ago, and Trump is forcing us to do it now.
Mark Carney will replace Justin Trudeau as the leader of the Liberal Party. He has to call an election by October, but it seems we might see that significantly sooner. How has this changed the domestic political environment in Canada? And what does this mean for the fortunes of the Liberal Party, which had seemed all but doomed just a couple of short months ago?
That's right. There is a huge contrast. If you look at the polls between where the Liberals stood, that is very far behind the Conservatives on January 6th, when Justin Trudeau announced his resignation, and where they stand now, right? They are catching up to the Conservatives. Mark Carney, as a leader, if you look at polling numbers, when you ask people if Mark Carney is the leader of the Liberals, how would you vote? And there are some polls saying that the Liberals could actually win, and even perhaps a majority government. And now they have a minority government only. They have had a minority government since 2019. So and they failed to win the majority of seats back in 2021. So it's totally a reversal. But this reversal is not just about the Carney effect. I would say that the most important aspect of this reversal is about the Trump effect. Many Canadians are standing behind their government in fighting back against Trump. And who's in government? The Liberals. And also Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, has been a bit slow to adjust his rhetoric to the Trump effect and the threat coming from the White House. And so that's related to the fact that there are quite a few similarities between his rhetoric and Trump's. There is some form of, right-wing populism at play here, both in terms of Poilievre and Trump. And the Liberals have been criticizing Poilievre, saying that he sounds really like Trump, and therefore he will not be able to take him on because ideologically they are, quite close. And so they have been playing these ads online where you just hear Trump saying something and Poilievre saying something almost identical to show that they are basically, like almost like twin brothers or something. I think it's a bit unfair because from a policy standpoint, I don't think that the Conservatives have exactly the same policies as the GOP under Trump. But still, the Liberals have been quite successful at this, linking Trump and Poilievre. And Trump has become the public enemy number one for many Canadians, right? So if we associate you with Trump, it's not a good thing for you, for most voters. And mainstream voters who are not happy with the Liberals might vote for the Liberals again or for the first time because they are afraid of what's happening with Trump and they don't think that Pierre Poilievre will be able to stand up to him.